Thank you for being here to watch Reverend Dr. Roger Teel as we interview him for this wonderful Wise Sage interview series put on by the Science of Mind Archives and Library Foundation. Welcome, Reverend, or Doctor, I should say, Roger.
Thank you, Dr. Marilyn. Now let's just drop the doctors on both of our cases now.
That's good for me.
Now that it's been all impressive and everything. And
yes.
Just call me Roger, and I'm glad to be here. Thanks for including me.
Thank you. So let's begin with your very early memories of your childhood. Tell us about your siblings, your mother and father, and where are you originally from, and kind of just build it up and tell us where you came from.
I was born and raised in Denver, Colorado, a suburb of Denver, Colorado. And I'm an only child. My parents just had me. They figured that's plenty. And I grew up in the north side of Denver before moving to the west side. And I remember, and I wrote about this in my book, This Life is Joy, a time when I was either 6 or 7. And I was laying on my front lawn, our parents' front lawn, and my dad had just finished mowing it. And I was just looking up at the clouds and the sky. And I had what I now understand to be something of a transpersonal or a mystic experience, because in that moment, my sense of being a personal, an individual person evaporated, and I was what I was looking at. I was the sky, I was the clouds, I was the light. And at some level, I thought I had died. But it filled me with such energy that when I came back into my local self, I remember having to clutch the grass just to stabilize myself. And it scared me. I kind of hid it away because I didn't know what had just happened to me. But it was this immersion experience in reality, in that which is the sense of myself and the other collapsed, and I was that. And what I noticed in looking back, it was then that I kind of started asking my parents if they'd take me to church. Now, they weren't church-going people at the time, and they weren't too keen on that, but they did say, you know, there's got to be half a dozen churches within a block or two of walking distance in this neighborhood. Check them out. So I went and I started just attending the youth church and whatever the activities were. And I enjoyed at that time just a sense of the spirit of it, because something I think had gotten downloaded into me in that early experience on the lawn. But the older I got, especially in my preteens, what I was hearing in those churches I tried out and what I was instinctively knowing weren't matching. And this, you know, I had a few friends in the churches, so I'd hang out in the churches. And, but increasingly, I was beginning to be troubled with this. About that time, my parents divorced, my mom moved to the west side, and there was a Methodist church that we started attending, and I enrolled in what they call confirmation classes, which is where they teach you all about how to be a good Methodist Christian, and you get confirmed eventually. And prior to that, and I enjoyed hanging around the kids who were involved, but prior to that, I asked the minister if I could talk with him. And by the way, then I think I was 13 maybe, possibly 14. And I remember an afternoon when I went to his office, and we had what amounted to about a 2-hour talk. And I would ask him these really challenging questions, like how could God save some and reject others? I mean, I wouldn't do that. And we talked, and he tried to give the party line answers, but I just kept peppering him, and I began to notice toward the end of it, he was getting redder and redder. And finally, he just called an end to the meeting. And about that time, my mother, Delma Teel, had discovered religious science. The church was meeting in a theater. What was then my church was meeting in a large theater before they diced them into small theaters, probably seated 500, I would imagine. And Dr. Fred Vogt was the minister, and he hadn't been in town a whole long time, maybe a year or two, but the church was beginning to gain great energy. And she heard about it and she went. And she wrote this Methodist minister that she'd like her membership transferred from that church to Mile High Church. And he wrote back and said, well, I'm very concerned for your spiritual welfare. I don't think that's a good move, but I'll agree with your request. And by the way, since your son seems to hold ideas different from the church, we'll drop him from the membership list at this time as well. Well, that ticked me off. And I got real jaded, and I said, ministers are frauds and church is a scam, and I'm not going ever. But then my mom was getting so caught up in Science of Mind, and she'd come home from the services and I'd try to hide away from her. She'd say, oh my God, you would have loved it. It's kind of like what we talk about when we talk about these things. I just wish you'd go. And I said, I told you, I'm not doing the church thing. And then finally, God, I'm sure after a year of that, it was either her birthday or a Mother's Day, and I don't remember which. I decided she would love it if I went with her. That would be a great present. And I did, and I was hooked. All of a sudden, it came together. What I instinctively felt from that experience and the teaching, and then you couldn't keep me from going. I was in my early teens, probably 14 at the time. I'd go all the time. I'd sit there. Occasionally I would go to the youth church. And one time I helped out because there was a kid there who was differently abled and they needed an older person. I wasn't old, 14 or 15, to help out. But I didn't like that much because I wanted to listen to Fred and I wanted to listen to this teaching, even as an early teen. And so I got into it. I took Science of Mind 1 from Fred. And at that point, the church had no property, rented the theater. They rented an office space. But so they held the Science of Mind 1 class in what was called the Bo Peep Nursery. And so I have these fond memories of getting deeper in this teaching in this room where lambs are jumping over clouds and there's all these kids' art, but it was kind of precious. And I just got more and more enthusiastic about it. I decided to go to the University of Denver for college. I'd been accepted at USC, but I thought, I want to stick around this Mile High Church and learn from Fred. So DU, I thought I wanted to be a psychologist, and DU had a good psychology department. So I started going there, and I continued to go to Mile High. Occasionally when I was in college, Fred would call me up and say, hey, Raj, I need somebody to do the announcements and do the reading on this Sunday. So you want to come over and do that stuff? You see, he was kind of prepping me, but I didn't realize it, but he was. And so, yeah, I'd appear with him on the stage and do those things from time to time. And I got done with my psychology major, and I went to Fred kind of in a crisis. And I said, Fred, I've done this. And the next step would be to get a master's, but I don't think I want to be a psychologist. I can't find the soul in psychology. And he said, well, Raj, you love this stuff we're teaching, and they've got a great religion department there at DU. I've run into some of those professors. Why don't you look into a religion major too? And I see he was working me all the way along. And so I did, and I completed a second major, and I loved it. I couldn't take enough religion courses until my parents said, listen, the tab is getting high. You need to go ahead and graduate. So I graduated, and I, again, continued to do, and by the way, I took practitioner training while I was in college. And got that accomplished. And then I went to Fred and said, what's a person do with a psychology and a religion major? And he said, well, I and a guy named Ezra Ellis and Al Lowe, we've set up a seminary for religious science, the first time it's had one. And it's out in LA, adjacent to Founders Church. Why don't you go out and take some of those classes? You got nothing better to do. And I said, well, okay. And he said, and by the way, I had worked my way through DU and went with my undergrad training, paying my room and board. My parents could, they were trying to meet the tuition as best they could. I did have a half tuition scholarship, but they were picking up the rest. And I said, you got to pay for your room and board and your books. So I worked for those 4 years as I played tenor banjo at a Shakey's Pizza Parlor near DU. with a piano and banjo, and we did sing along in Dixieland. And so when I was done with BU, Fred said, and by the way, you could still play banjo at Shakey's because it was founded out in California. And by the way, I earned more playing 3 or 4 nights a week at Shakey's because I had to join the musicians union than I could have made working 40 hours in some menial job that a college kid could get. So I felt blessed by that. So I went out to California and played at Santa Monica Shakey's near the beach, and went into the School of Ministry, and that's how I got my start. You want me to keep on rattling on, Marilyn?
Just a curiosity of, do you remember what year that was when you entered the School of Ministry?
Yeah, it was 1974.
1974. Okay, so then you went to the School of Ministry in Los Angeles.
Graduated in 1976.
Uh-huh.
And at that time, Elmer Gifford was the director of member churches. And he called me into his office and he said, you know, I think you've got some potential. I'd like to have you take our church in Santa Barbara. I said, well, Santa Barbara? I said, well, I'll think about it. So the next Monday, I drove up to Santa Barbara from LA, and I found the church, and being a Monday, it was all locked up, but it was a beautiful building. And I snooped around and looked in windows, and I immediately panicked. And I thought to myself, these people know what they're doing. Here you are, all of 24 years old, and even though I'd gone through the training, I was pretty clear I was green and wet behind the ears. And I said, you don't know what you're doing. So I went back and I looked in the open pulpit, the listings of churches that were available, and I ran across a little group in Portland, Oregon. And it said 25 people, no assets, but very enthusiastic. And I called up their board president. We had a lovely chat. And he said, why don't you come up and do a Sunday message and a workshop and meet with the board, and we'll see what happens. So I did. About 4 weeks later, I went up there, and they were lovely people. But one thing was very clear to me. They didn't have the foggiest idea what they're doing. And I thought, I have found my people. You know, they don't know what they're doing. I don't know what I'm doing. And if I fall flat on my face, it's way up here in the northwestern part of the country, and the rest of the country might not ever find out about it. So I went up there, and Elmer Gifford was livid. He said, you just signed your death warrant in the ministry. You'll never make it. You'll never amount to anything. Good riddance. And he was just so angry. But, you know, I went up there, and those people were, I think they saw my sincerity and that I loved the teaching and loved them. And those poor people had to listen to some of the most god-awful sermons God ever allowed to be preached. But, you know, I think they got my sincerity. And then over the course of about a year or so, I was shocked, but it began to grow. And so I just kept, you know, flying by the seat of my pants and doing my best. And I was a one-man office, and at times I was lonely. Here I was 25 by that time, and working 7 days a week at this little church. And at one point, they lost their lease of a Masonic temple where we were meeting. The temple wasn't going to meet on Sundays anymore, or open. So they found an old Christian Science church that we could buy. And the owner said, if you can come up with an $80,000 down payment, I'll carry the note. And I talked with the board president. He said, you know, 80,000, we don't have a building fund, but if we could somehow do that, the payments after that are easily within our budget. And I said, all right. Well, and the guy said, I'll let you move into the church immediately, and you can meet there, but in 3 months, I'll give you a 3-month deadline. You have to have the 80,000. And so those wonderful people, we started raising money. They dug deep into their savings, and we did every other kind of fundraiser you could ever imagine. But my treasurer called me a week before the deadline and says, Raj, I don't think we're going to make it. We're at 60,000, not 80. We're short. And we're just going to have to come up with a plan B and move out. And I remember that Saturday, prior to the Sunday where I was going to have to tell the congregation this bad news. And I couldn't sleep. And I felt like I was a failure as a minister. I'd let them down, and I'd built us up. We can do anything we believe we can. And now we weren't going to do it. And how could I possibly tell them? And I was just, I was in agony. But I remember early in the morning, maybe 3 or 4 in the morning, all of a sudden the light bulb went on. And I realized, wait a minute, this church, these people have come together as never before. And we've attracted more people with that energy. And the love and the enthusiasm is at a whole higher level. That's win enough. If we've got $60,000 we didn't have, we're a better congregation, tighter congregation, more loving than we've ever been. This is a win, and Spirit will guide us to whatever is right for us. And by golly, I knew my message. I went there the next day and told them all that, and there were tears, and people were standing and hugging, and we had claimed the win at the level of consciousness. So the next Tuesday, I went into the office to start packing up my desk, and some of the guys in the church were coming by in the next couple of days to load up our equipment and get it out of there. And I remember that Tuesday, I walked into the back part of the church where my office was and unlocked the door, and there was a white envelope laying on the floor. No markings on it whatsoever. And I opened it, and inside was a cashier's check for $20,000, the amount we needed. There was no identifying name on anything. To this day, I have no idea who did that. But what I know is the miracle was how we had come together in consciousness. And so we bought that church, renovated it, and then Fred Vogt called and said, Roger, I've always wanted you to be my assistant. I know you've got a good thing going there, but would you like to be an assistant with me? And it took me all of about 3 seconds to tell him yes. And so I moved back to Denver, and I spent 10 years working with Fred as his associate minister. Then I married my wife in year 9 of that 10-year path, and adopted our 2 sons, her natural children. Her former husband died of leukemia 3 years prior. And so I met her, fell in love with her instantly, and adopted the boys. We married. But a year later, in year 10 of being an associate, some things were going on in the church, and people were kind of trying to get between me and Fred. And I didn't ever want that to happen. I loved that man way too much. He'd given me so much, mentored me in so many ways that about that time, a position at home office was offered to me to be the director of churches and education, to create a new department called GEMS, Growth, Education, and Ministries. And I said yes. And so I moved Erica and the boys and I out to California, and immediately I hated it. It was a desk job in the Wilshire Center area of LA. And we had bought a home up in Simi Valley, and I'd drive an hour and 15 minutes minimum to get there each way. And I just didn't, I tried to do the best I could in the job, but I just didn't love it. I needed to be with the people and to be teaching. So a year into that, a dear friend of mine who I had gone to ministerial school with, Peggy Bassett, called, and we'd stayed very close together doing some projects and such. And she said, Raj, I've had this diagnosis, and I need help. And I know you know Big Church, having been at Mile High, so would you come be my associate here? And that took me about 3 seconds to say yes. And so I moved us down to Orange County from Simi Valley. And I worked with Peggy for a year as an associate, and she came to me at the end of that, and she says, I've got to retire. This ultimately it was ALS. And she said, I've got to retire, and I want you to be senior minister. You've got what it takes. And so for the next 2 years, I was senior minister at Huntington Beach, and Peggy had built up a huge work there, and in a shopping center, for a specialty center that never really flew, but she had rented up about 2/3 of it and had a 1,000-seat sanctuary in it and such. And for a while, for the first year, it was great growth for me because people were hurting. She was wildly popular, and people were grieving, and some were angry. How could you teach this stuff and not heal yourself? And Peggy had gone to him and says, don't pray for my healing. Pray for me to get what this is about. Pray for me to understand what this experience is teaching me. And that further enraged people. And she had a lot of feminists because she was very powerful in that town, and they were angry that I was a man. And so I had a lot of stuff being projected on me. So it was a lot of deep growth for me. But about after that first year, the church started filling up again. We did 2 services, and I told Erica, I said, I think this is going to work. We've gone through the rough patch, and this thing's growing again. And let's get a house down here. So we bought a house. And then about 6 months later, Fred calls again. And he says, Raj, I need help to retire. There were troubles brewing, and I just wanted to do talks and my TV show, and they wanted me to come to board meetings. And so trouble brewed, and I've had to fire the associate minister that I replaced you with, and he's taken a bunch of people away. But if you want to come back and lead Mile High, come back and after a couple of months, I'll retire. So we sold our newly purchased home at an enormous loss and went back to Denver in 1993. And I became senior minister then, worked the church through those troubles. And the other church that got started kind of wilted after a year or two, and people started trickling back, and then it just evaporated altogether. And we just started building up Mile High. And over the 25 years I was there, we renovated the original building that Fred had led the construction of. And then we built a huge community center, multi-purpose educational, youth, social area. Built some offices on site. And then in 2008, we opened up our 1,500 seat sanctuary, a beautiful domed building. We've got 2 domed buildings of different shapes. And in fact, it opened up on my birthday, April 6th, 2008. Great birthday present. And so I led that for that ministry for 25 years. And during that time, in the mid 90s, a group of us who had been on the INTA board kind of broke away from INTA for reasons I won't go into. And we formed an organization called the Association for Global New Thought. And I'm speaking of Michael Beckwith and Christian Sorensen and Mary Manning Morrissey and myself and a number of the leading ministers with large New Thought movements. We've banded together to create another New Thought organization that would take New Thought out into the world and link us with aligned organizations. And we did some great things. We created the Season for Nonviolence to teach nonviolence, the principles of Gandhi, King, Cesar Chavez, and such. And we formed the Synthesis Dialogues and invited upwards of 100 spiritual and social leaders to meet with us in 3 different places in 3 different years. And we had dialogue with them about world issues and spiritual issues. And then the Dalai Lama would arrive and meet with us for the last 3 or 4 days. And we just did a lot. We did amazing conferences called the Awakened World Conferences. So that was another way that I just leaned into supporting our movement. And I think the AGNT brought unity and science of mind and spirit, or unity and religious science, closer together. There used to be a big gap between them, but that was unnecessary. And so I enjoyed that. And I also stayed involved in what was then United Church of Religious Science. I served on its board of trustees and was chair for 2 years at kind of an important period, I think. Dr. Kathy Hearn, Dr. Christian Sorensen, Michael Beckwith, and I, as a quartet, got together to create the new design and organizational model to totally restructure religious science to be a more functional model, organizational model. And much of that still exists today. It's been altered to some degree, advanced. So I did my best as an associate minister, and then early on as a senior minister of Mile High, to be involved in the movement. But the Mile High started just growing so phenomenally. I think it became really the biggest New Thought church anywhere. I had to kind of pull away from being involved in the organization and just really tend to Mile High. The duties were enormous. And even though I had numerous ministers that I brought in to be part of the ministerial team, you know, the buck stops at the top. So I had to lean into that. And it was a tremendous ride. But in about year 23 of being minister there, I began to get the realization in my prayer work that I was heading toward a big change. That after 43 years in the religious science ministry, the pulpit ministry, it was time for a shift. And I did battle with that guidance. So I struggled with that. I said, how in the world? This is the greatest gig ever. And I love Mile High Church and I love our teaching. But the voice was insistent. It's time for you to do it a different way and get out in the wilderness, let it all go, and take on your next evolution of soul. So I designed this lengthy 1.5 year program of transition, and partway through it, I announced to the ministers and then the board, and then ultimately in September of 2018, I informed the congregation, and there was a lot of wailing and gnashing of teeth. But I never had made Mile High Church I never fashioned it to be a personality-centered church. A number of our larger churches were focused right on one single person. And when that person left, in almost every case, those churches collapsed or went way down. So I had always had a very strong ministerial team, and I leaned upon that. And it had gone through many iterations, but we still had a strong team. I designed a whole transition program, did a 7-week message series on embracing change and dealing with the feelings and building a bridge. It was called Bridges to Breakthrough. And we built a bridge on the stage and actually put a plank in it for every one of the 7 weeks. And toward the end, I walked over it as a symbol of walking into my new chapter. And the 2 new lead ministers that I had recommended to the board, Dr. Michelle Medrano and Reverend Joshua Reeves, they then walked over, and then the next Sunday they took over, at least in the series, and groups and members of the congregation walked over the bridge. So it was a good way for people to anchor that we can do this change. And so a couple months later, on March 3rd, it was my final Sunday as their senior minister. And the next day, March 4th, I marched forth into a new chapter. It was also a difficult thing. I spent a full year in various phases of decompressing and grieving and exploring. And I didn't do a whole lot, but I was told I would need that. And everything I'd read said, don't even try to recreate anything. Just really let go of, be in that transition space, which I did. And then earlier, late in 2019 and in 2020 here, I began to realize, okay, now it's time for you to teach again and to work with people again. And you can do it over the internet. And you can reach people that don't even know about our teaching. I'd been to several very large conferences, 2,000 people and more, and neither of them were New Thought conferences. But I was shocked to find out that in both cases, hardly anybody that I met in those conferences knew anything about New Thought, anything about science of mind and spirit, or unity, or any of that. And I thought, wow, there's a whole lot of people in close proximity to our teaching who don't know a thing about it. And so maybe that's the audience that I can reach out to and make a difference with. So that's what I'm doing. I'm doing webinars, as you know, Marilyn, and doing personal mentoring work and small group work. I still do meditation and prayer retreats. I am now minister emeritus at Mile High Church, and I speak there about anywhere from 2 to 6 times a year. And when the pandemic, COVID-19 struck, I assisted Michelle and Josh, the lead ministers, quite a lot. And I'm there for them with whatever they need. I still do 3 meditation and prayer retreats through Mile High. So we've got a lovely relationship going in which I support them wholeheartedly and yet give them free rein to take the church to its next chapter. And they named the sanctuary that we built the Teel Sanctuary, which was very gracious of them. And anyway, it's been quite a ride, but I'm not done. Just like you, Marilyn, I am not done.
There are a couple of things that I wanted to ask you about. First of all, though, I wanted to tell you that I live stream Mile High every Sunday, and I watched that whole transition. It was so beautiful. Your plan and how it worked out, it was just, I thought if every church could go through something like that, it was so great. And I'm sure that you are still, that Mile High is still progressing and growing, and as it was, even with the pandemic as it is at this moment. But
well, our founder, Ernest Holmes, he said a religious science church is a consciousness. Mm-hmm. And I may have made several mistakes through my time, but The thing that I think we did build up successfully at Mile High was tremendous consciousness and a great loyalty to both that incredible institution, Mile High Church, and to our teaching.
Uh-huh.
And I challenged the people to go deeper with this when I left. I said, and support this church even more, because we need lighthouses in this world. I don't know when a viewer is watching this, but 2020 has been a turbulent time. Racial unrest in our country, rising again, a pandemic, environmental and economic crises. To me, our teaching is tailor-made for times like this. Our founder also said, it's easy to practice these teachings when times are good, but you really know you're living it and understand it if you use it when things look worse. And I think it's now time for all of us to live by and express by principle and to help other people out there. And that's another reason why I'm doing this different kind of ministry, Marilyn, is to help people learn these things. You know, I can't imagine going through life without these principles. They're such a gift. And I know I'm preaching to you, the choir, on that, but.
You're very fortunate in that you recognized it early in your life and that you found it. Were you involved with the Parliament of World Religions? Did you attend those?
I did two. I attended two of them. The one in Melbourne, Australia, and the one in Salt Lake City. Yeah. Okay. And those were great too. But yet again, you know, there's that trite phrase that goes around that science of mind is the best kept secret. I hardly found anybody in these other faith paths that knew a thing about New Thought or science of mind and spirit. So, you know, we've got our work cut out for us to get this out in the mainstream. Now, some teachers like Wayne Dyer, who was a dear friend, Wayne wrote the preface to my book, or the foreword, and Michael Beckwith wrote the preface. Wayne popularized these teachings. I mean, he was simply a religious science minister out there doing it without that title. His work and others, you know, Marianne, Deepak, they're getting this kind of teaching. But the nuts and bolts of science, mind, spirit still needs to get out into the greater population, because we've got the tools and the understanding that sometimes these other teachers don't convey.
Right, and there are people like Louise Hay is known all over the world. I mean, you mentioned her name in any country just about, and oh yes, Louise Hay. So I know that some of our ministers refer to her teaching as, oh, you know, you're familiar with Louise Hay? Yes, well, that's what I teach, you know. So, you know, right. I know they're doing that kind of thing. So what do you see of the future of science, the mind, and New Thought? I mean, how do you see it growing, or really, you know, we're all over the world.
Yeah.
But not many people realize that or have even heard of us. I mean, my friends that I, you know, associate with, what is that, you know? And so.
Well, you know, we're doing this recording during the COVID-19 pandemic. And of course that has shut down a lot of things, and people are on Zoom as they never were. Yeah. And they're on the internet as to a higher degree, and taking webinars and learning things. And I pray that our centers and our teachers, like myself, can use this time as an opportunity to use these vehicles to reach out. You know, in the mainstream church, Christian church in America is in decline. And in fact, here in Denver, there's a lot of these huge cathedrals, whether it's Episcopalian or whatever, huge churches. And you know, there might be 100 older people meeting in it, you know, and it may seat 1,000 or so. A lot of people are opting out. And I think that there's some good news for us in this teaching, is that there's a growing skepticism around the distortion of Christian teachings that went on started in the councils after Jesus' death, when the Christian church was seeking to become a powerful institution. And so many kinds of theologies and doctrinal distortions, such as original sin and immaculate conception, and a lot of this kind of stuff, the chosen people, got instigated there to empower the church. And in this day and age, people are growing out of that. Now, I will also say that the evangelical church on the far right is attracting some folks, but they're people who just want the security of that kind of a teaching and the pat answers that it seems to offer. But more and more people are abandoning organized religion. I always tell them, if you come into New Thought or Science, Mind, Spirit, don't worry about organized religion. We're so disorganized, we're not of any peril in that regard. But this is a time of opportunity. We're getting skilled at reaching out beyond the bricks and mortars of our centers. Now, I don't think that centers, buildings, or places where people gather are going away. Not at all. In fact, the people I talk, Mile Highers here at Mile High Church, they ache to be back together. And I think we'll be far more grateful about the in-person experience that they've been privileged to have at this magnificent center called Mile High Church. And I know the other centers will have that experience too. And yet right now we're getting better at live streaming, at webinars and things like that. And this is our springboard to start reaching a larger population, many of whom won't step foot in the church, at least not initially. But if we tell them, hey, you can have a better life. In fact, you can create a life you really love. And you don't have to repeat the past. And you're better than you think you are. And you can learn to use tools. And they have a spiritual basis, but it's not about organized religion. And your life can totally change. There'll be people who would hear that. And I think that that's what we need to do is, yeah, we got to serve the congregations we have. But the churches that are growing are outward facing. They are mission driven. They've got a passionate mission to take whatever their teaching is out into the world. Now, that doesn't mean they don't serve the people that are there, but man, the people that are there are even fired up to take it out into the world. And so we need to energize Science, Mind, and Spirit and Centers for Spiritual Living with that kind of energy, that it's time for every center to be outward facing, to be doing the things on the internet through promotions and things like that, to where we're getting a greater and greater audience of people who simply want to know this truth and put it to work. And ultimately, that'll bless the churches. Ultimately, they'll begin to feel the safety of it and check out what it's like to be in a Science of Mind church, which is different than being in these other churches. But first of all, in the safety of their own homes, they need to learn that they can change their thinking and change their life. And that's what I think we need to be about right now. That's what's motivating me. And by the way, as an independent teacher of this and still minister emeritus at Mile High, hardly a workshop or anything that I do goes on without me telling them, you can get more of this good stuff at Mile High Church. So go to their website. So I want to be a bridge for people to get into Mile High, but I also want to be a safe presence out there where people can learn these things.
And Roger, you are a wonderful teacher, and I love hearing you and attending your online classes. And
Thank you.
so in closing, I would like to, are there any final words that you would like to say, in retrospect? But also, would you share with us some final words of encouragement, of wisdom that is within you, and share that with all of us, that we can go away and take away and keep that in our hearts. Thank you for being with us today.
Oh, Marilyn, thank you. Well, what's on my heart to suggest is that it's our greatest job on this planet, in this little span of time, this blinking of an eye, or what Goldsmith called this parenthesis in eternity, called planet Earth, to fathom the depths of who we are, individually and collectively, and to discover our spiritual magnificence, and discover that we're designed to be co-creators with the infinite love intelligence, the divine spirit, with God. so that we can then come out of the throes of the lesser frequencies of human thought and begin to explore with what Thoreau called the license of a higher order of beings, so that we can take on the mantle of our godliness, not in an egotistical way, but knowing that we are co-creators with the divine, and that we're here to create the kingdom of heaven on earth, as that teacher said, on earth as it is in heaven, on earth manifest as it is in the mind of God. We're the bridge between the mind of God that holds the ultimate of all good and infinite possibility and the conditions and situations on this earth. So it's time for us to step up. It's time for us to step up, not just for our own self-interest, but to step up and to manifest more of our divinity and our limitless capacities as spiritual beings. And in so doing, then we help lift up the baseline consciousness of humanity. As the great teacher said, if I be lifted up, I draw all unto me. And so we need to lift ourselves up and draw others who are ready to us, and begin to create a higher frequency of love and oneness on our planet. And you wouldn't be here if you hadn't signed up for that.
Hello, my name is Marilyn Leo. I am the founder of the Science of Mind Archives and Library Foundation. I trust that you have enjoyed this interview, which is part of the Wise Sage project of the archives. It is a gift of love, as is the foundation itself, and depends entirely on your generosity. We appreciate your donation in support of the preservation and availability of our science and mind history.